Apple blossoms for pollen. So I will, I take the blossoms in this balloon stage, like right before they open, pull off the petals, and then comb the anthers off. And that's the male part. So it has the pollen in it, but it doesn't release the pollen until it's dry. The anthers go into these little jars and are allowed to dry, and then the pollen is stored for later use. All right, this is apple pollen, and this year I have apple pollen for sale in the web store, or I will, because, let me just remove this. Because people want to work with the varieties that I talk about, but it's like if I sell the pollen, you don't have to go get the scion, graft it, grow it out for several years sometimes until it finally makes flowers, and then you can collect some pollen or pollinate the blossoms or whatever. So I'll have maybe 10 or so varieties in the web store starting on Saturday, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute. But first I just want to show you real quick how I pollinate apple blossoms. So what we have here is Whittick pippin, and I'm going to look at the cluster and I'm going to say, well, this one, and this one are going to open within about the next day, probably tomorrow. This one's already slightly open, so it could already be pollinated by a bee. And this one is too small. So this one comes off, this one comes off. Get rid of everything that you're not going to pollinate for sure. Now we're going to take off these petals very carefully. It's best to do this, they say it's best to do it in late morning when the bees are super active, and it's just physiologically the time the flower expects to get pollinated, I guess. But I've had pretty good luck doing it in the late afternoon like this. And we're just going to take off all the petals because these are like a bullseye for bees, right? They spot the petals and they can see the petal and they zone in on the flower. So without the petals there, the bees probably won't ever touch this. And I used to take a pair of scissors and actually cut off all of these little pollen things, which are the little yellow things here. But I don't do that anymore. I've actually just stopped doing anything and I just leave them on there. And that's because I've seen some apple breeding videos about, like large scale apple breeding projects where they don't actually remove any of these because most apples are not self-pollinating. So I just stopped doing anything. It makes it way faster. I can prepare a lot of blossoms and pollinate them really quickly. And I'm trying to pollinate a bunch this year so that hopefully I'll have some seed available next year of specific crosses, which is even more exciting than having pollen available. But don't count on it. We'll see. I have to get through the whole season and everything. So once I have this, I've just started using these turkey feathers. I just shot a turkey this morning, and I'm just going to take that and grab the feathers up close here and tear off most of the feather. Now there's not very much pollen in these bags, so you want to make really good use of it. I think this is probably a good way. You could also use a very fine sable paintbrush, like the retouching paintbrushes for photography. They're very, very fine, it's like a little tiny point. I've used my finger. You can use all kinds of stuff, but you want to make sure that you don't waste too much because, like I said, these bags are rather small. So we're going to do Whittick pippin with pink parfait because they're both late hanging apples, and pink parfait carries the red flesh gene. And even though it's not strongly red flesh, it's one of the lighter ones, it still carries it. So the offspring of these two could be something that could be used for further breeding. This isn't my actual first choice to use, but I don't have any grenadine pollen this year. So I'm just going to get this brush down in here, maybe wipe some pollen onto it, and as long as you can see a little pollen on there, you should be good. I don't know about these feathers. It just doesn't seem to be working that well. I often just use my fingertip. It just depends. Like here I could probably get away with that because I don't need much more of this pollen this year. Just kind of get into the bottom of the bag and wipe a little on your finger. But this is one of the more wasteful ways to do it, so watch out. But you need very, very little, and you're rubbing it on the 5 little green things in the center. In some varieties they stand way out, like here you can see them, they're standing out a long ways, as much as maybe 1/8 of an inch even. But on other varieties they're hidden down inside here, so you may need to move these aside a little bit or cut them off or something like that, or at least get down in there and rub deeply into the flower. And I'm going to label this with the pollen parent. Obviously I know what this parent is. And then in about June or July, I'll come and I'll label the fruit itself with a Sharpie like this. So if it falls off, I know that it's pollinated and I know what the parent is. All the money from this will go towards the apple breeding project in general, whether it's like irrigation or labor or fertilizer, whatever. I'm just, saving the money aside, earmarked for that project. And what else? Well, you can read about the varieties of pollen I have, and there's little notes on those, on the different varieties on the website. So yeah, one thing I will say is that I have stored this for a year with no particular care, just like sitting in a cupboard, and used it successfully the next year for pollinations, but I've also had it seem to fail, and I just can't, I don't really know what the best way to store it is or how viable it's going to be, next spring. So I know the timing's not going to work out for some people. That's just up to you, whether if your season is early like mine, you're going to miss out on pollination time, but you could try storing it, maybe freezing it. I don't know, you'll have to do your own research on how to store pollen well. Okay, that's it. Later. Here's an apple blossom that's cut open. Around the edge, the outside edge of this green leafy looking part called the sepal, are these stalks that hold the anthers or pollen sacs, these little yellow guys. In the middle, there are 5 pistils, these long stalks, and on the end of that is this little sticky tip called the stigma, which is sticky so that the pollen will stick to it. Once the pollen sticks, it germinates down the tube, down the pistil tube, into this lower area. This will actually become the fruit. And once the tree knows that this is pollinated, it will bother to grow a fruit around the seeds. But if this doesn't pollinate, it won't bother to grow a fruit, because of course the whole point of the fruit is to get an animal to eat it and transport the seeds elsewhere. This one's crossed with Wixon. That should be interesting. And this one's crossed with Cherry Cox. Look at that beauty.